You may think that privacy where you live is dead, and you'd be reasonable to think that, a long, outdated construct that your country says it values and perhaps used to, but really no longer does, or at least increasingly so. Today I'm going to tell you some of the problems that we're seeing that are taking away your privacy in ways you may not have even heard about, and what you can do about it, and where you can go. One of the things I've talked about recently, whether you like TikTok or not, whether you think it's good for people or not, is how the TikTok ban in the United States puts that country on par with Afghanistan and Pakistan. No other country really is going so far as the United States, and I think that's going to have repercussions for entrepreneurs included. But what it shows is that countries, legacy brand countries, are taking a heavier hand with intervening into the private affairs of their citizens. Now that other countries around the world, like China, are emerging and have more viability, have a greater presence in the world, the United States and other legacy brand countries, which had the show to themselves for a while, are increasingly saying, yeah, we don't want that. Somehow freedom of choice no longer matters. They say it's for your own good, but governments say that a lot, and they usually don't mean it. And so one of the things that stood out to me, though, besides TikTok, we've talked about that already, is that in the first TikTok ban bill, when this came up about a year ago, Reason Magazine actually went through and said this could be interpreted at some point, if this bill passes, that the government can get rid of VPNs, virtual private networks, that allow you to maintain your privacy when you are online. And they said that the government claims it won't do this. That's not what the law is about. They talked to various lawmakers, and no, that's not what we're trying to do. But Reason Magazine said of the initial TikTok bill, the language was very broad and it could be interpreted that, hey, you can't use a VPN. And this is interesting because the United States, I think, looking at laws around the world, I'm not a lawyer, but I occasionally look at different laws, and it's remarkable to me in some of the smaller countries that we deal with, just how much smaller the laws are, how you can actually read them and understand them. The bills are not 3,000 pages. I mean, sometimes they're 10 pages or 5 pages. They just get right to the point. In the US, in these multi-thousand page bills, they often bury little things in there. You saw this in the Trump tax cuts even. There's some nasty stuff in there. You saw this when Obama brought FATCA in, which basically forces all the banks around the world to tattletale on Americans who were required to report their foreign bank accounts. And so, could you have a bill that bans TikTok? And people say, okay, fine, it's China, let's be against them. But buried in there is, VPNs. Or at least what I've said before, all right, they'll use broad language, they'll do things to the back door, they'll impose de facto bans, and then later they'll be able to come and say, yeah, you can't have VPNs. And certainly, I can tell you, I have been to places where internet service providers on their own, not the government, but the ISP says, we don't allow VPNs. And if you try and use a VPN, your internet doesn't work. You don't think that the ISPs would just go along with the government if they said no VPNs? Of course they would. They would just shut off your access to the internet. We have to know everything that you're doing. And so that's something that is increasingly troubling. And what bothers me the most, and when people say, oh, you're picking on the US, why do you hate the US? I don't hate, but I think that it's concerning when so many people say, this is a free country, or in the case of the United States, which is why we talk about them the most, this is the most free country. Yeah, it has its problems, and many people won't even admit that, but it is the most free country in the world. That's just statistically, qualitatively, and quantitatively not true. But the fact that so many people think that is why it's important to understand that there's a lot of places out there where you wouldn't have to deal with this. Here's some other headlines that I've come across recently. How about how WhatsApp is spying on you and they sold your private messages to Netflix? The government allows them to do this, and you could say that's freedom. You agree to their terms and conditions, but they're looking at what you're saying. There's other things happening. How about this from the Daily Mail in the UK saying there's a new Big Brother satellite capable of zooming in on anyone from anywhere in space, and it's set to launch in 2025. Privacy experts say we should definitely be worried. They're basically saying a new satellite with close-up imaging would invade people's privacy. Well, they wouldn't want to do that, would they? Well, of course they would. We've known that for over a decade now, and some of us imagined it was coming for much longer than that. The Daily Mail says privacy experts are sounding the alarm on a new satellite capable of spying on your every move, set to launch in 2025. The satellite, created by startup Albedo, is so high quality it can zoom in on people or license plates from space, raising concerns among experts that it will create a Big Brother is always watching scenario. The company claims the satellite won't have facial recognition software, but doesn't mention that it will refrain from imaging people or protecting people's privacy. They're not going to promise that. This is the stuff that they lied about in the past. They don't even have to lie anymore. Albedo signed 2 separate million-dollar contracts with the U.S. Air Force and the National Air and Space Intelligence Center to help the U.S. government monitor potential threats to U.S. national security. That's what they always tell you. This is everything's for your security. And that's just the line, and the average person eats it up. Oh, of course. Okay, well, then I won't say anything. Albedo has raised $35 million in just a few months to commercialize a very low Earth orbit satellite, in addition to $48 million that it raised back in 2022. The team says they hope to eventually have a fleet of about 24 spacecraft that can spy on you for governments like the United States. This is a giant camera in the sky for any government to use at any time without our knowledge, says Jennifer Lynch from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We should definitely be worried. And a Harvard astrophysicist says it's taking us one step closer to a Big Brother is watching kind of world. Now, as we've told you before, there's probably some people who aren't that concerned about this because according to the Cato Institute, from 2023, nearly a third of Gen Z favors the government installing surveillance cameras in homes. We've talked about this before. They call it a very Orwellian concept. And so what's interesting is when you look at the numbers by age groups, by the time you get to 65 plus, only 5% say yes to this, but 29% of 18 to 29-year-olds say, yeah, okay, domestic violence and all that kind of stuff. Sure, put a camera in my house. Put cameras all over my house. Basically a 6-to-1 ratio. You can look at the graph and you can see every generation is less and less interested in this. When I say momentum in legacy brand countries is heading in the wrong direction, this is what I mean. In just the course of 2, maybe 3 generations, a 6-fold increase in stuff that people even today would say, what are you talking about? Imagine if someone said that 10 years ago. Would you even believe it? Of course you wouldn't. You'd say that's crazy. I mean, put cameras in our homes so that the police can watch us. And just in case something happens, just always be on camera. Well, you've got people who are comfortable being on camera now. And they don't realize what people in other countries that we talk about, like Serbia or Georgia, like people there kind of realize, yeah, the government, we've seen when they've used this against us. And over time, perhaps that vibe goes away, but certainly there's still that vibe present now. Like we remember when that happened and the government was kind of in our business and we don't want that again. I don't know that Gen Z in the US or Canada or Australia really knows that. And so the momentum is definitely going in the wrong direction. Who needs the government when you have a new generation of people who, well, I guess you need the government to actually do the spying on you, but they're all in favor of it. And the question for me is, why you don't want to live in a big country. I'm going to elaborate on this in a moment, but one more headline from The Economist, which says that living outside China has now become like living inside China because the Communist Party there wants to tighten its grip on the Chinese diaspora. They interview people who didn't want their names used. Professionals who are neither dissidents nor activists yet fear the watchful eye of the Chinese state. People who've left places like Shanghai to work in Europe and elsewhere, and they keep in touch with friends on WeChat, the Chinese app, realizing some of their messages have been censored. Even in their new country, they're careful of who they talk to in public, what places they go to, and they want to make sure that there's no members of the Chinese Communist Party there. Now we've seen, and we've talked about for years, the US government obviously has a very large presence around the world. The Chinese government has a large presence around the world. They're building that. They're doing a lot of diplomatic work all over the place. And there are concerns that people who are from China will be spied. You can take that for what it's worth. I would argue that any big country wants to do this. And so when you say, where do I go to where they're not going to put a camera in my home? Where do I go to where they're not going to fly surveillance drones that they can look at me doing absolutely anything from the sky? Where do I go where they're not going to invade my privacy and the messages that I send on my phone? How do I escape this system? For me, the answer has always been you want to have countries in your life that don't have the DNA, the means, or quite frankly, the desire to surveil on their citizens. And perhaps the desire, I suppose if any country became a big superpower, perhaps they would attract people who wanted to be in office, who wanted to do superpower-like stuff. That to me is one of the fundamental challenges of a big legacy brand country where they're so content on kind of telling people around the world what to do, is when that goes away, they get really nasty. And it also attracts people who like to do that. If you're running to be in office in St. Kitts and Nevis, a country where you can get a passport by making an investment, a country of fewer than 100,000 people, you're not getting into office because you want to go out and tell everybody else around the world what they have to do, or start wars around the world, or set up drones. Like, what do you do in St. Kitts and Nevis? Well, a very substantial chunk of their revenue comes from their citizenship by investment program. So number one, you have to keep, very good policies for foreigners that they would want to have your passport. You have to say, okay, we don't have income taxes. If you want to come and live in your country, you don't have to. You don't have to live here, but if you do, we're not going to tax you. You can't be, screwing with people all over the world, because why would someone want to be your citizen if you are screwing with them the way that they're talking about the US or China screwing with people? You have to have good policies. And when you raise a good chunk of your money for your budget from a citizenship program, what are they doing? They're building roads. They're building schools. I have watched what the St. Lucia Prime Minister, where I'm a citizen, talks about. They're actually doing something good with the money that you donate. It's actually directly impacting, in many cases, low-income people. It's building schools. People get better educated. They have to actually be responsive to the people, because they don't all hide in Washington, D.C., in the wealthiest counties in the United States, while everybody else in the hinterlands just goes about their business. They have to be responsible. They have to be accessible. And so, sure, St. Lucia, if they had a population and world domination, they would surely attract politicians who did the same kind of stuff we're talking about. But they don't. It's not in their DNA, because they're not a large country. They don't have that power. They don't have the means, and they have to be responsive to, spending the money that they do have on actually serving people. So generally speaking, I think smaller countries are better. They're more nimble. You have better, power structures, resources, and incentive. They can't as easily just print cash because they have the world reserve currency to go out and do stuff against people. And so if you look at, the two countries that have full-fledged citizenship-based taxation, you're a citizen, you pay no matter where you live. And I always say, yes, Americans, you can move overseas with a business. We help people all the time reduce their taxes as Americans, but you are still a taxpayer, even if you're paying much less. You're not out of the system the way a Canadian, Australian, German, Irish citizen would be. The US and Eritrea have citizenship-based taxation. Eritrea is called a bully. The United Nations tells it to stop, and they don't really effectively collect much of anything. Why? They may have the desire. They don't have the power. They don't have the means. What's Eritrea going to do? Send people over to rustle up every taxi driver in San Diego and tell them, where's your 2%? Now, they can say we won't renew your passport, perhaps, but there's even holes in that. And so the US government can get away with doing this kind of stuff. Other big countries, other legacy brand countries that can do things like print money, that have the power, that have this kind of global heavy hand, they can get away with it. And, world reserve currency, they can control international banking. They can compel other countries to submit to their wishes. Somebody made the comment, if Uncle Sam's dominant situation deteriorates, it will no longer have that option. He said, Andrew is right about getting out before the big collapse. So I think it's okay to want to have privacy. I think privacy, to a large extent, is dead in Western countries. But here's what I'll tell you. Do you think Vanuatu is going to start flying surveillance drones? Now, listen, maybe some of these big countries start surveilling us all. This company, if they raise enough money, you need a lot of these cameras, I would suppose, before they're coming to Vanuatu or Montenegro or anywhere else. Maybe at some point you're just totally screwed. You know what? I'll take the next 20, 30, 40 years of my life living happily, knowing this stuff isn't, to the same extent at least, happening to me. And listen, maybe one day you're all screwed. I fundamentally think there's always going to be countries that push back on something. And that's why I say, if you build a passport portfolio, have one that's weird. Like once you get to the fourth or fifth one, and I know this seems weird, like having 4 or 5 citizenships. Like if you do, find one where it's like really off the radar, and they're just like, we don't have the time or the patience for this kind of stuff. And I've said, African countries pushing back, you can laugh at that, but I mean they were some of the most open countries in recent years. Someone mentioned Tanzania particularly. I'm not saying that's your place that you're going to go, but I just think there's always going to be places. African countries push back against the global minimum tax. They're like, this doesn't benefit us. We don't want to be part of this. As the world becomes more multipolar, there will be blocks of places that are like, yeah, please come here. We want you. Look at El Salvador. that president is pushing back against some of the Western powers, and he may not be able to do that entirely. But he's like, yeah, we're going to have policies that benefit people, low taxes, pro-business, pro-freedom. There's always going to be a place. And you didn't know El Salvador 5 years ago, before this guy got in, was going to be that place. So you want to have different options. You want to have residence permits, and you want to have passports that you can go to places. By the way, El Salvador is part of the Central America 4. So if you were one of the other 4 countries, you could also have some reciprocal privileges in El Salvador. So sometimes when you get passports that are part of a bloc, the European Union, the CA4, the African Union could become bigger in the future. Mercosur, ASEAN, and Southeast Asia. There are others, and there's others being developed as we speak. For example, in Africa. If you're part of that, open Balkan now, small confederation, not so much freedom of movement of people in the Western Balkans. Having those passports is going to be good because more countries are going to get together with like-minded countries, more regional focus, more multipolarity, and the smaller countries that are outside of this system, that have more resources, that are increasingly becoming wealthy, they don't all want to follow the U.S. People complain about China. Sure, maybe I'm with you. But there are going to be more countries linked up diplomatically with China. And what happens when they do that? The U.S. goes berserk when some country, let's say in the South Pacific, links up with China. Why? Well, of course it's easier for one country to have sway over everyone. But they're the ones who want to put surveillance cameras over you so they can watch every single thing that you're doing. They're the country that's going in the wrong direction, where people are saying, please invade my privacy, I beg of you, all while they raise your taxes. So quite frankly, I'm glad I don't live in that world. Even the places that I go in the Western world, I think are more hands-off. I spend a good amount of my time out of the Western world, where you could just tell by the culture that people don't want that. Nomad Capitalist Live, our live event, we host it this year in Malaysia. There's a sense of soft freedom there. People just want to be left alone. If you come and experience the live event, you'll feel it when you're there. I really think you will. I felt it there for over a decade. There's other places that you'll feel it. Small countries out of the Western world, without the power, without the means, without the desire, I think is the big one, to control you. That's where privacy is not dead.